Welcome to the Get Published podcast, sponsored by Brodie Consulting Group. To get more information about our coaching, publishing, executive ghostwriting, and podcast production services, go to getpublishedpodcast.com. Hello, I am Paul Brodie, and thank you for joining us for another episode of the Get Published podcast, where we help authors get published with a proven system that works. Today, we're being joined by Mark Sephton, author of Plot Twist. Mark, welcome to the show.
Great to be on the show, Paul. Really looking forward to getting our teeth into this podcast today.
Excellent. Well, let's get started. Question number 1. What is the one piece of advice that you would give to a first-time author who is currently writing their book?
I think the simple answer would be to make it about the reader.
Yeah, I think that's pretty clear.
Yeah, I think, like too often, even in business, we tend to think that, our business is about ourselves, and we kind of fall into that trap. And I think it's the same with anything we produce. Of course, there's going to be a part of our personality and our DNA within it, which is fine. But I think, for me, when it comes to writing a book, it's got to be about doing something for the person who's going to read it. The same with a podcast. It's got to be about the listener.
Yeah, they got to know what they're going to get out of it. Because if you don't have that mentality going in, then you might be in for a hard time. Because if you're making it all about yourself, that's not always going to help. Because what you want to do is talk about your journey, but the main thing is you got to tell them what they're going to get out of this. What is it that they're going to get out of reading your book? How is it going to help them? How is it going to help their business, or how is it going to help their lives? It's got to be all about them.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I don't know whether I'm being too simplistic there, Paul, but for me, I think if I'm just being honest, I think, even though it seems really simple, but I think, people do fall into that trap.
Yep, I agree with you completely. Well, what do you feel is the hardest part about getting published?
Well, I guess it's belief, because, I self-publish my books. You don't have to get a publisher. You can bust your chops and you can try and get published, which is fantastic. But equally, there is something to be said of being self-published, because you kind of learn and see more of the intricacies of the process. I guess it's the flip between having a birth at hospital or a birth at home. There's certain things that you just benefit from going through yourself. Whereas obviously if a publisher called me up and said, we'd like to publish your third book, then of course I would listen, and maybe I would go with it because of the fact that I have self-published 2 others. But I think for me, really the difficulty or the biggest challenge is whether you believe your message and the content of what you write is actually going to change lives or impact or influence or educate. So for me, I think the only barrier is really belief in your own message.
Well, let's talk about marketing. So please share a marketing strategy that you have used in your book launches that has worked well.
Well, I must admit, I got dubbed, a one-man marketing machine when I launched my first book, Inside Job. My first strategy actually was I went onto LinkedIn and I looked at my connections and looked at how many were authors. And there was roughly around 120 of my connections were authors. And I personally messaged each of them and said, would you mind sharing one marketing tool or tip that when I come to launch my book can really give it legs? And probably 80% of those people came back to me and shared one thing. So I created a whole list of ideas and strategy of how to launch my book. And there was a few things on there that I'd kind of come up with myself. So I'd actually be happy to share that, Paul, with your listeners. It's a real simple 1-page document I created, and it doesn't go into massive detail, but people get an idea. I'd be happy to share that.
Okay. Where can they go to get that information?
Yeah, I guess it depends on how the podcast works, but I'm sure we can create a link, or I can send it to you and you can distribute it, depending on how that works. But I'm sure me and you can figure that out offline.
Excellent. Well, I love that strategy. The fact that you did your research on LinkedIn, which I'm a huge fan of LinkedIn. That's what we
Mm-hmm.
utilize in particular to get guests on the show and for business
Yep.
opportunities. I love LinkedIn, and I think what you've done is such a great strategy with getting advice from other authors, specifically on LinkedIn, and asking them for one tip, because that's absolutely perfect because everyone's going to have something different. Now, were you
Mm-hmm.
asking for one specific tip in regards to a certain area, or was it a little bit more generalized when you did the reach out?
No, it's very specific in terms of just a marketing strategy of how I could get my book into as many hands as possible.
Got it.
And so with that, I came up with probably, a number of, ideas, and then I just followed them, and then I created some of my own, and it can be I mean, of course, there's times for us to be strategic, so even the people that you may ask to endorse, your book, if these are people that, are in the public eye, and, we all like to kind of be associated with other people, and if there's a genuine link there, they read your book and they really love that, then of course they're more likely to kind of mention this book to their other circles because they're on the back of it or they're in the middle of it, and so sometimes, simple things like that, including other people, can really help.
Well, and if you don't mind, would you be willing to share probably about two to three of the best tips that you feel that you received from doing that outreach? And I know we'll have an option to have our audience potentially get the entire file, but could you share probably two to three of the best tips that you received?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there was a lot of crossover in terms of feedback from suggestion, from anything from being mindful of the people that you get to endorse the book, so you've got that mutual benefit, from other things to doing like a giveaway on like a Facebook Live, or at the time when I was doing it as a Periscope. So you can incentivize people to win a copy through various marketing techniques through Facebook Lives and YouTube. And then I think another good tip for me that worked really well was to really utilize your network, and get people to really be a part of the story. So sometimes, when you write a book and you involve and maybe have some quotation from somebody that I think that that's a really good way to encourage people to mention it beyond just the fact, oh, my friend's got a book. But if they're actually in it, people will then want, to go out of their way because, we all like to be talked about. We all like to have a mention. So for me, sometimes it isn't just the obvious things in terms of marketing. Sometimes it's actually using the relationships in a way to really build credibility and a community to be able to share the message.
Excellent. Well, thank you for sharing that. I'd like to now ask you, speaking of books, I'd like to know what is your favorite book and what was the number one thing that you learned from it?
Well, the interesting thing is the fact that at the age of 27, I hadn't read a single book front to back, and it wasn't until I came across this book called The Crossing, which is a book by James Cracknell and Ben Fogle. James Cracknell is an Olympic gold medalist, and Ben Fogle he's a TV presenter, and he does a number of TV shows, mainly in the UK. But these guys had a real good friendship. But the whole premise of The Crossing was based on a true story, which was for them to row across the Atlantic. And I actually bought the book because I was heading over to America from the UK, so I wanted a book to read on the plane. And I couldn't put this book down because it was full of adversity, challenge, difficulty. The boat capsized. They lost all their drinking water, extreme conditions, lots of heat. While they were rowing across the Atlantic, it showed pictures of the sores on their body. They got sick, so they had like food poisoning, a number of just incredible things that would take people to the brink of a mental breakdown. And it was fascinating because, for me, grit is one of the key components of being an entrepreneur or being somebody of influence, because life can send some of the hardest challenges to us. And I think it's that ability to not quit despite discouragement, or obstacle, which is, I guess, a part of the definition of perseverance. The reason why this book really spoke to me is because it was real life. It was two men that were facing extreme elements, and yet they had every right to quit and to throw in the towel, but they didn't, and they actually rowed across that Atlantic Ocean, which was an incredible story. And for me, that was the catalyst to actually not just reading books, but also being tenacious in the fact that regardless of what life throws at me, to keep going.
Excellent. And for a final question, what is your favorite quote and why?
I think my favorite quote, it almost sounds a little flippant, but I love it because it's really simple. And the author is actually unknown. But the quote is, if you don't change direction, you end up where you are now. And I really love that because, if none of us do anything different, we're always going to end up where we are. And so for me, it's the challenge of realizing that if you're not happy or content with where you are, then you really need to realize that the direction that you've been going in needs to change. Otherwise, you're going to end up at the same place. And for me, I just love the simplicity, the audacity of that. And yeah, I find it really profound.
Excellent. Well, Mark, I want to thank you for being a guest on the show. What is the best way for people to find you online?
Well, probably my website, marksephton.com, because it has links to all my social media, and I'm probably most active on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. My Twitter and Instagram handles are @SeftonMark, and then people can find me on Facebook at Mark Sephton.
Well, Mark, thank you once again for being on the show, and I wish you all the best in your author journey ahead.
Thanks, Paul. Really enjoyed that.
Thanks again for joining us today. To learn more about how you can be featured in our brand new Get Published business book, go to getpublishedpodcast.com.